Charlie Camosy, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Last time we talked, I had to leave early, so I'm glad to continue the conversation here.
Yes, Charlie's referring to a working group that we held in advance of the October conference where Charlie is going to be presenting. And it was really great to meet you, Charlie, in person, sincerely, and looking forward to seeing you again in October. Um, Marcus, I think you're going to lead things off.
Yes, thanks, Brandon, and thanks again, Charlie. Great to see you again virtually. I want to begin by thinking back to some of the general themes in your presentation at the working group that Brandon mentioned. You were talking about diversity and specifically thinking about sort of the Christian contribution to the way we think about diversity, Catholic perspectives on diversity, both within Catholic spaces, but also across wider spaces. And in your remarks about the specifically Catholic perspective on diversity, you alluded to some key Catholic concepts like the body of Christ and the Holy Trinity, both of these being touchstones for how we think about unity and diversity. So maybe just to begin, Charlie, could you say a little bit more in general terms about how you think of Christian or Catholic perspectives on diversity? What should our starting points be when we reflect on the nature of diversity, the value in diversity?
Yeah, well, I guess the first point I make is maybe not a confessional one or a theological one, but just a general one, right? So I don't think a commitment to diversity makes sense apart from a larger commitment to unity. So diversity's reason for being comes from a commitment to unity. And the example I gave in my remarks, maybe because I was still thinking about college basketball or something at the time, but is a basketball team, right? So you don't just want random sort of incoherent diversity on a basketball team. It's not good to have a lot of short people on a basketball team. It's not good to have people without hand-eye coordination on a basketball team. It is good to have people who are maybe a little taller, that can jump a little higher, who are faster, have longer range shooting, who are stronger. That kind of diversity is good because it fits the unity of a basketball team, what the basketball team is for. In a similar way, I think we can apply it to an ecclesial context where we think about, the body of Christ. We say many parts, one body. It's very good that there are different roles to play in the body of Christ. Paul points this out very clearly in his letters. It's good that we have arms and legs and feet and hands and chests and hearts and lungs, and this all contributes to, however, the unity of the body of Christ. That's what it's for. It's not just sort of random. It's the image of the body, I think, does a very good job of sending that signal. But then you get to a kind of Trinity, like we worship obviously a triune God, and it really does emphasize the importance of diversity within unity, maybe even more the diversity part, because the relationships are the way we distinguish the three persons in one divine being, subsistent relations, sort of the classical way of thinking about that. But even those are not, just sort of random relationships. They also are inherent in a unity, right? Of a single essence, single being. What I get frustrated by, and this is maybe one reason I was invited to give the presentation I did, is I think maybe we don't always think about diversity that way in Catholic and Christian higher education. Sometimes it appears anyway that diversity is just sort of there for the sake of diversity without the unity being present.
Yeah, that relates to actually the first question I wanted to ask you, Charlie, which is that I'd really just like you to elaborate on something. So you spoke both about the contemporary university and the broad Christian context or Catholic context. And with respect to the contemporary university, you said that obviously diversity is in the zeitgeist, it's emphasized, but the fact that unity is needed is denied or acknowledged only obliquely or at the margins. So one diagnosis you make of the contemporary university is that diversity is emphasized, but the fact that you need unity in order to make sense of diversity, again, is either denied or acknowledged as an afterthought and somewhat superficially. And I think you elaborated by saying that some people on college campuses, some people in university leadership are genuinely unaware of the need for unity or what might unite the diversity of the university. But others, you said, perhaps are being disingenuous and playing a self-aware game where a term like diversity, and I'm quoting you, is intentionally unsheathed and used as a weapon at the service of advancing a particular agenda. So I guess I'm relating some of the abstract discussion we just had about diversity to your critique of the contemporary university. And then I just want to note that in addition to that, you went on to say that in Christian contexts, we often end up playing a similar kind of game. So maybe perhaps you could just talk in a little more detail or a little more concretely about what you observe in the modern university and in Christian or Catholic conversations that illustrates this problem.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, I don't think I know true believers, as it were, in diversity who maybe just haven't thought about it very clearly, or just, what water said the fish type situation, just don't recognize the need for unity or how unity is functioning within the calls for diversity, and are, if you ask them, genuinely believe we should let 1,000 flowers bloom, and somehow actually believe that they are trying to do that in a good faith way, even if they aren't quite where they need to be yet with some of those goals. But maybe more often, I think I've seen folks who are in fact playing a game, who are aware that diversity is a word that has a lot of power. It's a loaded word in many ways. It is a ticket in some ways to getting where you need to be. Is if you can show you're being diverse, then you get to the places you want to go. But often, what's actually done in both appeals to diversity and actual attempts to make diversity hires, or have a diverse group of faculty or staff, is the actual things that matter most, like the unity we were just talking about, are really not challenged. They're not. There aren't diverse perspectives that are brought in as a result of the so-called diversity hires. They may, in fact, be diverse in some ways from a racial and ethnic perspective, from a social class perspective, from a sexual orientation perspective. But very rarely, in my experience, and I think the experience of most people I talk to about these things, are the actual foundational values, the unity that is so clearly in play and being defended here. Almost never are those commitments challenged. Let me just give you one example. So I work in medical ethics, bioethics, and one of the things that's been clear for some time now, not least because of the very checkered past in medicine when it comes to racial justice, and how especially, but not only, Blacks have been treated over the centuries by medical institutions. There's been a deep distrust of the medical field, especially at the end of life, by Black communities in the United States. It's very powerful. It shows up very clearly, for instance, in the debates over physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia, even sometimes the debates over healthcare more broadly, about who should have power in distributing healthcare resources and that sort of thing. Even a thing like hospice, which for most of my life I just assumed was a sort of good thing, is looked at very skeptically by communities of color because of these reasons, related to these reasons. Never, and I've been around now bioethics in the academy for a decade and a half now, more than a decade and a half. I've never seen a kind of critique of our end-of-life practices coming out of a racial justice context, or a context that was aware of that history. Similarly, with regard to abortion, we know that Planned Parenthood and others had very serious eugenic racist motives for thinking about how contraception and then abortion would function in particular cultures. The end result of that historical embeddedness of racism, structural racism embedded in our culture, means that most abortion clinics, frankly, are in communities of color, and communities of color are disproportionately victims of abortion. But that I've almost never, except from a very few subset of pro-life academics, had anybody really talk about it that way. The zeitgeist, the prevailing ideology, the underlying unity that is being defended won't let itself. It's insulated from those kind of questions being raised. And so while in theory, again, we're pushing towards a kind of diversity from certain perspectives, the foundational unity, which is really at the heart of this, is kind of hermetically sealed and safe, and not allowed to be challenged. That's my experience anyway.
It's interesting because you seem to be saying that, and here I'm backing up a little bit, but you seem to be saying that in the academy there's much talk of diversity, there's little talk of unity, but in fact there may be too much unity and too little diversity. And maybe a secondary problem is that not explicitly talking about unity, or we might say not explicitly talking about unity might be an additional problem, because explicitly talking about unity could be productive in that it could lead to a conversation about what should be uniting us. And there might be disagreement about that. I actually had never quite thought about it in that way, but I think there's a lot of, power and truth to that. Feel free to respond to that, and then we'll go to Marcus.
No, I think it would be the principles of the contemporary academy with regard to diversity would lead to it, if we had more honest conversations about what's actually happening here, would actually lead to some challenges about the having diversity with regard to the actual underlying ideology. Like, should we have, for instance, pro-life professors in bioethics that could actually challenge those of us that have different views about these questions? Maybe we should hire some of those people, but those people never get hired, almost never, unless people sort of hide their views and play it very safe, and then sort of come out later, as it were, after tenure or something like that. Because those principles, that unity is just so closely guarded. At least, again, that's one person's experience, but I think it's broadly shared by lots and lots of folks.
I think as you were speaking during this last exchange, I think I was going through the same realization Brandon was. So I was wondering, Charlie, if you could help me think through this. I was thinking, when invocations of diversity go wrong, or when their invocations of diversity are made in ways that are dysfunctional, let's say, before this exchange, I would have thought, oh, on the surface level, invocations of diversity make it seem like we're for something. We're for sort of broadening the circle of those who are included in this institution or who are hired into this profession or something like that. But what's going wrong is that actually diversity is being invoked in order to work against something which is viewed as, for whatever reason, this perspective, this intellectual perspective, or the mission that this institution has been devoted to in the past, we're against this. And so we're going to use the language of diversity as a way of working against or undermining this changing or working against the status quo, let's say. But what I think I'm thinking this through now, what may actually be going on is that diversity is invoked in favor of or for the sake of an unacknowledged unity. right? For the sake of defending or for the sake of promoting this kind of conformity or this kind of unity, which isn't being thematized or isn't being made explicit, but which still is sort of doing the work there. Does that track with you? Or do you think that there's something that needs to be added?
No, no, that sounds right to me. I mean, not in every circumstance, but I think in many circumstances, that's true. Again, if there weren't a kind of ideological defense underlying all of this in the service of ideological unity, if we were really hiring, for instance, Black bioethicists um, at a without concern for that kind of sort of game playing and defense of ideology underneath it all, we would expect a number of very public, very prominent Black bioethicists to be out there very publicly challenging what's going on in California and their attempts to try to expand physician-assisted suicide, and what's going on in Canada, which is just a horror show with regard to this. I just heard the news yesterday that I think it was Delaware's House just passed physician-assisted suicide. There are big fights now in Minnesota over this, New York. So, this is not happening. We don't have Black bioethicists speaking out at all, as far as I can tell, and I pay very close attention to the field, because that would signal, or if that were happening, that would signal that there is a genuine commitment to having a plurality of views, a diversity of views, and not just hiring somebody who is Black, who also sort of undergirds, or at least doesn't rock the boat with regard to the foundational unifying principles with regard to these things, which are almost uniformly deeply skeptical of anything remotely pro-life, in a way that's frankly pretty disturbing, but is very real and very clear. Yeah.
Would it be fair to say that in your view, in the university, the current problem is, even though there's a lot of talk of diversity and very little talk of unity, the actual problem is probably one of too much unity and too little healthy diversity? Whereas let's say in Catholic discourse, the problem actually is right now too much diversity and too little focus on unity, too little unity, a losing sight of what Catholics all have in common, and too great a tendency to demonize one another, et cetera. So, yeah, that's the question.
Yeah. I mean, I guess it depends on the institutions we're talking about. So I would say, with regard to your first question, yes, there is too much, especially for the stated goals of these secular institutions, which again claim to be about diversity, welcoming marginalized people with marginalized views, marginalized perspectives, equity, these kinds of publicly stated values. There's an underlying conformity, a conformity to a unity there with regard to all sorts of issues and topics, and some might say, oh, well, that's just real. That's how we have to. We can't just have, going back to the basketball thing. If universities are for something, it's not just random diversity that we want. We want a kind of diversity that sort of fits with our underlying unified understanding of ourselves. And if we understand ourselves as kind of activists, organizations in favor of certain kinds of political or ideological goals, then how would it help to have a Black pro-life bioethicist on your faculty who is going to throw a few flies in the ointment, right, and cause problems for that understanding of oneself as a kind of activist organization for a kind of ideologically driven perspective? It won't. It doesn't, which is why these are closely guarded unified conformist perspectives. I think it could be a little more complicated if we focus on Catholic institutions, because in some ways, depending on which kind of institution we're talking about, Catholic institutions are just as ideologically possessed in very similar ways. I've experienced this myself at both of my institutions, including my current institution, where my pro-life perspectives are really not welcome by lots and lots of folks. And for reasons, I think, along the lines that I just suggested. It is a little more complicated because, including at the last two institutions I've been at, there are some who do in fact welcome them, and some in leadership who do in fact welcome them. But in theory, anyway, these institutions are for a unity that presumes the sacredness and viability of human life. That should go the other way, right? It should be like, well, we got to have some stopping points, right? No child sacrifice, no white supremacy, these things that we just say are just not up for grabs when it comes to academic debate. You would think that there would be more focus on that kind of understanding of human dignity at these institutions. And in some there are, right? At some Catholic institutions, there's a growing number, in fact, of small-ish schools that really do have this commitment at the heart of it and are honest about it, straightforward about it as part of who they are. But I know there's a very large number of Catholic institutions that, I don't know if this is the way you said it, but maybe don't have as strong a focus as we might hope on that kind of commitment to human dignity and the inviolability of human life.
And one more thing before you come in, Marcus. I was also referring to some of your remarks at the working group about Catholic public discourse, so which is not an institution, it's just probably internet conversation, but I'll just quote something you said. And I'm taking this a bit out of context, but the quote is, "And very often it goes well beyond losing sight of the dignity of our perceived opponent. Sometimes their dignity is the very thing explicitly being questioned or attacked. Descriptions of fellow Christians as monstrous or diabolical are unfortunately a dime a dozen in what passes for Catholic discourse today in the United States." So that's actually what I was referring to. And I said that the problem, at least in Catholic discourse, might be too much diversity, really too little authentic unity. Obviously, there are the resources for authentic unity, but people have taken their eye off the ball.
Yeah. Well, I think that's in part because of, in higher education anyway, so much of what we've articulated about a secular context has been absorbed by many confessional institutions, Catholic institutions. Our standards for promotion and tenure and for what counts as good scholarship, and excellent scholarship, as good hires, as different rankings, is very often has very little to do with the tradition that we claim as our foundation, and has a lot more to do with the kind of secular standards outside of that tradition. And so these kinds of then judgments are very clearly made, right? If one maybe have excellent scholarship when it comes to, say, the way that historically Catholics and other confessional groups have stood up for the disabled in attempts to in the face of eugenic attempts to marginalize and even euthanize or kill them. That sort of scholarship, at least in my experience, is not welcomed in secular context the way it should be. In fact, it might smell of a kind of pro-life Catholicism that would be labeled with the kinds of judgments, especially, but not only in a post-Dobbs, post-Trump context, where people get put into these boxes that I think I mentioned in that quote. So yeah, that kind of right versus left ideological boxing fight to the death that is so dominant in our broader public discourse gets imported in ways that confuse this as well, and really not just confuse it, but really dramatically harm our ability to even talk about these things, right? I mean, there are certain people who won't even be able to engage in the kind of conversation that we're having now because of these commitments and these labels, and just their sort of it kind of ideological possession that just hurts our ability to even talk to each other.
I'd love to return in a minute to these issues you were just describing, Charlie, about polarization and pigeonholing, both within Catholic spheres, but also outside them too. But before we do, I just wanted to return for a little while longer to this issue of unacknowledged conformity or unacknowledged unity in higher education. And I'm thinking about, how we can respond. How should we
Mm.
how should we think about those sorts of issues? If we think of that as sort of a dysfunctional way of relating to a genuine value, which is diversity. Um, and is this just too simplistic to think that we should think about, well, let's just, check the pulse. Do we think that this higher education institution, its mission is, related to inquiry, related to the dissemination of knowledge. And if we think about that things in those terms, then we should also welcome a kind of intellectual diversity, a kind of viewpoint diversity. That's the language that's often used. Is that just too naive, or is part of the response? I mean, it's obviously going to vary from place to place, from institution to institution. But how should we bring in those sorts of considerations? Should we nuance them, finesse them somehow? I mean, obviously there are, ways that viewpoint diversity conversations get derailed. You alluded earlier to, the sorts of fringe cases that nobody would really take seriously, hiring people who advocate for moral horrors, Holocaust denial, advocate for the abuse of children, that kind of thing. So how should we think about this kind of approach?
I mean, I guess one challenge is just how those concepts, while real, are again manipulated and wielded to exclude um, positions which hurt one's ability to do the work of um, ideological activation. Um, I mean, I'm just thinking somebody, for instance, who takes a Catholic view on abortion, which says no direct abortion for any reason, right? Any reason. And even tries to make the argument, and I've written a bit about this in my own academic work, that every woman's life can be saved without doing a direct abortion. This is a really contested issue for on lots of levels. But this is the official position of the Catholic Church: no direct abortion for any reason. You can never aim at the death of an innocent person for any reason, period. It's an exceptionalist moral norm. For many people, that might as well be child sacrifice. That might as well be white supremacy. That is a moral horror that we just simply don't allow anyone to speak about, right? It's just it can't be touched. And anyone who even, again, sort of smells like that or might be like associated with that, should also be extremely we should also be extremely suspicious of them, and not allow them to participate in the conversation. And then more and more, I think, because this is such a successful tactic to marginalize one's opponents, the set of all things that become that get put into those categories just grows, because, hey, if we can just say you have questions about child transition, say, you're in the transphobic category, and we can sort of safely dismiss you as not serious, or you're anti-LGBT, even better, we can put you in the midst of this acronym that is also held in a sacred way, and cannot be violated in any particular way. And so the successful weaponization of this, sometimes real, sometimes dishonest and not forthright, I think presents a huge challenge for the kind of vision that you just articulated, and not too simplistic. I mean, there are still people out there who believe this. One of them, I'm about to attend his retirement dinner at Princeton in a few weeks, is Peter Singer. He's an old school liberal. I think it's fair to say he and I have become friends over the years, though we obviously have a ridiculous number of very profound disagreements about these matters. We're both deeply committed to the kind of exchange, kind of vision that you just laid out, and we're both interested in defeating each other's arguments, right? We're both interested in showing how the other is deeply, deeply misguided. We're also interested, frankly, in finding areas where we agree and also trying to work together, actually, to promote those. And there still are a few of those old school liberal, in the best sense of the word, folks around. But Peter Singer himself shows that you can be an old school liberal and be an activist for the kind of things that you agree. And there's nobody more of a, maybe he was the quintessential academic and activist at the same time, right? In fact, he probably was responsible for the animal rights explosion of animal rights activism in the 70s and 80s as anyone was. But the kind of activism, the kind of ideological protectionism and conformism now is of a different kind, it seems to me, and it's sort of interesting to think about the retirement of Peter Singer as perhaps a cultural marker, right? Is the kind of academic who believes in the vision you articulated in your question, who also is an activist, is that gone away? Is that no longer present? Can it be retrieved? Can it be brought back? Can it come back in a different form? I think these are all big questions to ask, but I think something can be said very true about Peter Singer's retirement is he came out of a certain time, and that time is very different right now. It's a very, very different time right now.
Yeah, so I'm going to say a few things about that and then pivot. I think we're similar in that we profoundly disagree with Peter Singer on many issues, but greatly admire and kind of long for people like him who can react calmly and courteously and very rigorously to perspectives that are diametrically opposed to his own. He really is, I think, a model in that regard. And it's very fun to, I imagine it has been very fun for you to interact with him and exchange ideas with him because of that. So I think the liberal mentality that Singer exemplifies, one question I have in my mind is, or one hypothesis in my mind is that kind of liberality, that kind of openness to a wide range of ideas, it may be downstream from social cohesion and high trust. It's the kind of mentality that can take root and flourish in a, again, very cohesive, high trust society. But as the society becomes less cohesive and lower trust, that kind of attitude is simply going to become less predominant in the population. That's perhaps one way of thinking about why the shift is occurring. One other observation or hypothesis is that in any society, there are going to be some people who are very open-minded and very willing to play with ideas without getting too emotionally invested, angry, fight or flight, etc. But society on average is always going to have a moral core and moral taboos, views and behaviors that are regarded as outside the pale. I think that's inescapable and even a good thing. I think one thing that many on the right don't understand is that the problem is not the existence of Overton windows. You need Overton windows in a society, I think. Your society needs to have a moral core. There needs to be penalty, at least informally and socially, for immoral thought and behavior. And the question is really where to draw the lines between what is sayable and unsayable, what is legitimate and illegitimate. And that is a domain of contestation. And it's a domain of contestation that I would say the cultural left has just absolutely been cleaning up, for the last few generations. So those are just a few thoughts that came into my mind as I was listening to what you were saying, Charlie. I did want to pivot to a new question because there's a lot of interesting material in your presentation that I wanted to get to, but I feel like I just said a lot. And so if you would like to respond to any of it, feel free, or I can just pivot.
I just say a couple things, hopefully quickly. I do think you're right that something has changed in the culture about trust in institutions, maybe even a general sense of sort of doom, that can come from doom scrolling on social media, or just a sense that everything is terrible, um, that can activate people in ways that think that their particular commitments are just so profound that the very nature of the culture is up for grabs. The very survival of the culture is up for grabs in a way. But I wonder if that comes from a kind of particular a culture that has been particularly framed and even created by social media. That I mean, Singer, came of age in the Cold War, where there was literally, existential stuff going on. There's these stories about when he was hired at Princeton, just massive protests of him and his classes. When he spoke at Germany one time, given that the eugenics of the Nazi Holocaust was so obviously up front and center, at least then in Germany. I think it's faded now, unfortunately, ways that I don't think we're prepared for. But then, like the activists, the pro-disability rights activists, just loathed him. I mean, there was a story of a protester getting up on stage, ripping his glasses off his face and stomping on his glasses, crushing his glasses underfoot. And then after that, like he wanted to hang out with the people who disagree with him about this and like get their arguments. And he wanted to show that I'm not anti-disability. I think he was, but so, in some ways there's nothing new under the sun in terms of these concerns, but maybe there's something particularly destructive about the doom scrolling that so many of us, including myself, are doing on social media that just sort of puts one in a different kind of mindset that make people like Singer less possible. I don't know. And I agree with you about the outside the pale and having Overton windows as good things. That's what the commitment to unity requires, right? That's what on a basketball team, we're just going to not have somebody who can't catch the ball if you pass it to them, right? You just can't have random diversity. It has to be for something. And that's part of what Singer and I were arguing about. Like, where is the Overton window? He would push me on, embryonic stem cell research and say, if you think this 8-celled organism is should stop us from doing life-saving research, then you've reached an Overton window. You have kind of this absurd position about this 8-celled organism. And I would say things like, well, if you think we can infanticide newborn girls, kill newborn girls because somebody doesn't want a girl, which follows from your position, because they're not rational and self-aware creatures yet, then you've reached an Overton window with your point of view. And so in some ways, our extended debates were about trying to find and convince others of where those Overton windows were in fact.
On this Overton window issue, which I think I agree with both of you about, I'm just thinking about it a slightly different way of framing it. I just wanted to introduce one more thought before going back to you, Brandon. I think there's at least two ways of asking a question. Let's call them inquiry and doubt, right? So you can ask a question because you want to understand this commitment of yours, and maybe it's a really fundamental commitment. Maybe it is one of those things which to seriously call that into question would be beyond the pale, but you want to understand, right? You want to hear the best possible reasons for holding this view. And then there's doubt, where maybe you're asking a question because you genuinely want to undermine people's conviction about this issue or something like that. It seems to me a big part of what we're seeing is increasingly loads of people are unable to grasp practically, existentially, that distinction. If they hear a question, they respond to that as a doubt, right? Or they're just not even interested in the inquiry game, and they just want this idea to be disseminated in a way which is resistant to that kind of more serious intellectual digestion. And I think that's equally a part of the troubling social dynamic that we were just discussing.
Yeah, at the risk of repeating myself, I just think that that's where so many people are in the academy right now. I came of age in an academic context where it was about the first two kinds of things. I think now a lot of folks take classes, they go to college expecting to be activists. They take classes which expect them to be activists, and they get into higher education with the goal of being activists. And if it doesn't fit that um, goal of advancing a particular agenda, um, then it's just simply thrown out. It's not interesting. It's at least not interesting to me, and it's possibly in some cases actively harmful and needs to be defeated. It needs to be marginalized, not engaged. There's no curiosity. There's no attempt to understand. Not even to undermine, because that might not work. You could use the tools of the trade to try to undermine, and it's still, people could have these beliefs anyway, and so they just need to be defeated. They need to be marginalized and destroyed.
So Charlie, I want to pivot now, because a lot of your presentation at the working group, this probably isn't how you would frame it, and you can frame it, more precisely, obviously, if you would like, but very broadly speaking, you were interested in the question, okay, so how does one do this right? That is, how does one, in some community, whether it's a university or some church institution, or we might even say as citizens of a country, but how does one unite unity and diversity properly? And you said a lot of things. And so I'm just going to kind of go through them to give viewers and everyone in this conversation a sense of the broad contours of your thought on that. And then maybe we could zoom in on particular aspects as you and Marcus see fit. But as I saw it, you said a few things. So again, in order to do this right, in order to unite unity and diversity in a community, like how does one behave? How should one behave? And so you said, well, a good analogy is that of a grounded family. So in a grounded family, there can be profound and even painful disagreement, but except in really tragic cases, there's this abiding love that transcends and overcomes it all. So that's one thing one might think about as one is thinking about other communities that aren't literal families. But more specifically, when you're having a difficult conversation with someone, always think about the person's dignity. Always keep in mind that you might be wrong, that you might have something to learn. So listen to others with humility. This relates to something Marcus said. Map out and pay close attention to power dynamics. I would be curious to hear you talk a little bit more about what kinds of things you have in mind there. Because again, I think you were saying, if you want to do this right, if you want to unite unity and diversity, one thing you need to do when you're interacting with others is map out and pay close attention to power dynamics, which is probably a kind of phrasing we would associate more with the prevailing ideology in the academy today. But it doesn't mean that frame of analysis is completely wrong. Okay, so that's another thing. Lead with what you're for, not with what you're against. Intentionally resist and even deconstruct artificial antagonistic binaries. Always seek to find significant common ground across difference, especially in the spirit of encounter. I'm almost done here, but one thing I want to add to this is that you also very importantly note that none of this means that you can't get angry. You might have reason to be angry at people. In fact, as you point out, familiarity breeds contempt. If you don't know someone well, you don't grasp them well enough to know their flaws well. But if you know them really well, you grasp them well enough to know exactly what their flaws are, and that can breed contempt. Okay, so none of this rules out getting angry at times, although then there's a discussion about how properly to be angry. Mm-hmm. It doesn't rule out, or this is more a question for me, does it rule out having enemies? And I'm thinking here about, the injunction to love your enemy implies that you can have an enemy. Can a family member be an enemy? I'm kind of curious what you think about that. But so doing it right doesn't rule out getting angry at times. It may not even rule out having an enemy. Although maybe it does. We can come back to that. One thing you note is that it probably rules out mocking your interlocutors and trying to own them, trying to own the libs. But it doesn't rule out, I would think, being like having a sense of irony, kind of lightly noting inconsistencies in your interlocutor's position. It doesn't rule out trying to persuade your interlocutor. That is, there's nothing unloving or ungenerous about having a strong point of view. Your interlocutor disagrees and you want to persuade them of your point of view. And finally, it doesn't rule out authority. In fact, authority is essential for unity. And you point to the example of the Pope, obviously, in the Catholic Church. It's interesting to think about, but it's very interesting to think about authority in these other contexts, like the university or the nation as a whole. So anyway, but I felt like a lot of your presentation was kind of about, so how do you do this? How do you unite unity and diversity? Here are some principles of action, but here are some things you're still allowed to do. Yeah, I'm just kind of putting that on the table. Maybe I could just turn it over to Marcus and say, Marcus, is there any aspect of that you would like him to elaborate on, like the power dynamics? Or Charlie, if you'd like, you can just kind of give an initial response to everything that I said. Either way is fine.
I'll just take 30 seconds to say this. One of the opportunities/challenges that religiously grounded institutions have, especially Christian ones, Catholic ones, is we imagine ourselves as part of a body of Christ. We have brothers and sisters in Christ, that baptism makes us brothers and sisters in Christ. And if that's real, and I wonder how real a lot of people actually think about that, especially if it's somebody they may think of as an enemy. Then a lot of what you just articulated ends up looking one way, but a lot of the other institutions that we're a part of have really no way of imagining ourselves as families like that. It may develop in a particular context here or there, like a particular department or group might feel very close and might even think of themselves as a kind of family or something like that. But for Christian institutions, we are united in our baptism this way. Again, I'm not sure how often we acknowledge that or talk about that or explicitly think about the implications of that. But anyway, just to throw that out there as just kind of like an addition to what you said.
Brandon did put his finger on one of the things I was hoping to hear a bit more about, which is specifically how you were thinking about how we should think about the role of power dynamics when we're having these conversations, or when it comes to the ways that the diversity conversation unfolds. Here's where I'm coming from. I think, especially in the Catholic tradition, but in the kinds of philosophical reading that have formed me, I think you find the idea that suspicion makes for a bad foundation for a hermeneutic, right? If you start from a standpoint of suspicion, it seems like that's a severely limiting or counterproductive perspective. Certainly in interpersonal dealings in general, that seems to be true. And yet, there are sometimes good reasons to be suspicious, or there are good reasons to be come into a dynamic from a more skeptical point of view, or an attitude that a third party might say that seems that's a bit jaded or cynical. I'm interested in finding the right way to strike the balance. I'm not sure if there's an Aristotelian golden mean here. I'm not sure if that's exactly the right framework, but how, especially people who define themselves in terms of the thought that faith is an intellectual virtue and that friendship is, a deep part of human relationships more generally. How should we think about power dynamics when it comes to conversations like these?
There's so much to say about that. Let me try to pick up on the thread that you laid down. here. I used to have as one of my principles to always assume that your partner, your conversation partner, your interlocutor is acting in good faith, because precisely because of maybe something you suggested, which if your hermeneutic is suspicion, it doesn't go very well, and very little argument about the disagreement. The actual disagreement is engaged, and most of it focuses on like your secret motives for actually holding the position, or what's actually going on here. But over the years, I've just discovered, and we've talked about this a little bit already on the podcast, just how many people are acting in bad faith. I mean, it's just an extraordinary number of people. And so I don't know about a golden mean. I do think one needs to hold it in balanced tension. And Christians and Catholics are, at least in theory, supposed to be holding lots of things in balanced tension. One has and maybe here family can help us, right? One probably has a family member who lies a lot, who can't be trusted, right? And who, in fact, it would be not a good idea, in fact, to engage in a way that assume this person was telling the truth based on past experiences. This is one reason why familiarity breeds contempt in certain circumstances, because there are things that people do that are contemptible, right? That provoke the right kind of response. And sometimes it is anger, and sometimes it is a situation where you need to work to counteract what one's family member is doing. But if the family understands itself rightly, the bonds of the family should never be broken by this. In fact, it should always come from a place of love. It should always come from a place of, this is my uncle, this is my cousin, this is my sibling, this is my father. And those bonds can't be broken by this. They can't be. They're just given bonds to us. And if that's the way we can see each other, then perhaps that balance can be achieved, right? I can understand that family member X is my family member, and I love them, and they'll never stop being my family member. I'll never stop loving them. At the same time, it's not good that this family member is doing this, and it's bad for them. It's bad for the people they interact with. It's bad for the culture, whatever it is. And I have a duty to call them out on that and say that this is what's the deal. Now, I can also say, because this person is my family member and I love them, that if they have something to say in response to me, I ought to listen to that, and I ought to sit at the dinner table and let them give an account of themselves and say, Charlie, you think it's this. You've made it very clear. Let me explain to you why it's not that. And we can have a kind of back and forth with regard to those things. If the whole family dynamic was not part of that, right? It's not clear, because I have my agenda and they have their agenda, which is at odds. My job, again, might be to do what is, again, we've mentioned a couple of times now, is often done, which is just railroad them, marginalize them, defeat them, right? Destroy them. But again, this is the real opportunity that Catholic and Christian institutions have, is if there are brothers and sisters in Christ, we can't do that. That can't be the way we approach them as human beings. So maybe that does force us to be in that sort of, I don't know if golden mean is the right way to think about it, but at least a very tension-filled place that we need to live in.
I think that approach of being realistic, but keeping things in the perspective of this foundational bond, or this given bond, in some cases this unbreakable bond, that fits very well with some groups, right? The Catholic Church being, fellow Catholics. That was one of the cases you had in mind, or many of your examples were from family bonds. Marriage, certainly from a Catholic perspective, we would think of as the paradigmatic, indissoluble bond. But perhaps with other group contexts that wouldn't necessarily come to the fore, or at least not in the same way. So, if your after school club is being, torn apart by ideological differences, or if your place of employment, right, is suffering from these things as well, or the university at which you work in some cases, right? Then the options and the what's held as non-negotiable and what the possible moves to be made, those things are going to look somewhat different. So I wonder if um, that could be a good. Charlie, did you want to jump in on that or?
Maybe just very briefly. I
Sure,
mean,
yes.
I don't want to just collapse all human relationships into one relationship, because that's not correct and would undermine the very notion of family being special and different.
Right.
But there is the brotherhood of humanity, and there is the person before one being made in the image and likeness of God, a temple of the Holy Spirit, right? Or some people might argue that that comes from baptism. So let's just say made in the image and likeness of God in a very particular way that demands our reverence, that demands our attention. That's in fact where human dignity comes from, right? In my very explicitly theological perspective, there is no basis for human dignity really, as we understand it in the West, as being about fundamental equality, other than coming from that fact that all are made in the image and likeness of God. So while it wouldn't quite rise to the level of family, and that we ought to allow for the scandal of particularity, as some people say, when it comes to our relationships, there is this underlying unity as well, that should also lead to a certain level of respect and care and love, that would go beyond just thinking of somebody as, or someone's as, just something to be defeated or someone's to be defeated.
On just that note, Charlie, we have been using the word contempt a fair bit, and it relates to the thought of, I mean, it came up partly just because of the saying familiarity breeds contempt, and that has
Yeah.
clear application, right? But it does bear on this question that Brandon raised, which is, when we're in these ideological exchanges and when we're talking about and advocating for these, deeply contested commitments, is the friend enemy sort of distinction, is that the right way to approach this? Love your enemy. Chesterton, there's a quip of his, right, where he says, well, because of course you will make them, or you will have enemies if you're attempting to live the gospel. Don't worry, the enemies will come. But it's a separate question to ask, should I think of people in terms of enemies because they oppose something I think is deeply important, or am I in the business of making enemies, or how should we think about these things? And I mean, I raised this question just because you were describing that our perspective has to be informed by, I mean, certainly if we're Christian or Catholics, this reverence for the imagehood, the invariant dignity that our fellow human beings have. But still, there's the question that Brandon first raised, which is, to what extent should the thought of enemyhood, if I can put it that way, enter into our dealings here?
Yeah, I think there's no reason to reject the category of enemy, especially since Christ himself uses it in the context of saying, love them. And that's maybe a good, wonderful place to live in terms of not easy, but in terms of having a balanced tension, saying this person is an enemy, right? Usually with regard to a particular matter, or not just in some existential sense, like this is my enemy in my whole life or something, in a narrative sense. Usually it has something to do with a particular value, a particular goal. Um, you know, yeah. And so if for instance, one has as one's, at the center of one's life, a particular goal, X, let's say, and another person has a particular life goal, not X, or the defeat of X, that person is a de facto enemy with regard to that goal. But Christ is very clear about our duties in this regard, right? We need to love that person. We need to pray for that person. We need to turn the other cheek when it comes to that person. And these are difficult things. These are not easy things, but these are the commands of Christ to us very clearly. In some ways, but one of the wonderful things about taking the long view of these questions is that often the enemyhood, we should make that a word, of that seems to be present in one era turns out to look quite different over time, especially if we're talking about centuries. So one example I used in my remarks was, is it fair to say that Peter and Paul were enemies in the early church? I don't know if that's too dramatic to say. I think it might be the case, right? I mean, they had very different understandings about proper relationships with Gentiles, obviously, or about the hypocrisy that came with various kinds of actions, especially eating with Gentiles. The early church had a huge debate about this, in which it just wasn't clear what the proper relationship with Gentiles ought to be. But as I mentioned, I think in my remarks, the Catholic Church now celebrates the feast day of Peter and Paul together, right, on the same day. That would have been unthinkable after the Council of Jerusalem, which was an attempt to sort of like find unity in the midst of this horrible disagreement that really was really difficult for the early church, the very early church. And so maybe that should also temper our the way we handle these things, is to say, well, this looks one way now, but because we're part of this extended family over time, not just space, that should be something we always have in the back of our minds, that what this looks like at this particular moment in time very probably won't look the same way in the next millennia, where it's likely we will still have a church, and they'll likely look back at this disagreement in a very particular way that's quite different from the particular way we're looking at it now. And that might also, again, be a way of sort of contextualizing the particular moment of enemyhood that we have at any particular moment.
So we've only got about 15 minutes left. So Charlie, I'm gonna just say a few things and you can sort of respond as you see fit. And then, maybe Marcus, you can come in for a final question or remark. First of all, I just wanted to share something kind of personal, which is that, individuals obviously differ so much along many different dimensions. I have a great capacity for anger. And this has been true since I was probably around 10, maybe even younger. But I remember it from age 10. Like, I played tennis, and at my country club, I and this one other guy, we were just known as the people who had volcanic tempers on the tennis court and would like just smash balls like out, like into the trees surrounding the courts and just yell and be unbelievably angry if we weren't able to execute what we wanted to do on the court. And but it's interesting, and like my fight or flight response is very easily activated in interpersonal situations. Like, it's very easy for me to get really angry at people who I think aren't treating me well, or who in some way seem to be unfairly thwarting my will. And I'm 41, and only in the last 2 years have I actually recognized this as a major problem. Actually, I consider it, like, for the last 2 years, I've considered it the biggest problem in my life, the most important thing I have to work on. But more specifically, what I've had to work on is in my interactions with people, both in professional settings and in personal settings, never losing my connection to them, even if they do something I don't like. Because what I've done historically is, once I get into fight or flight mode, the person becomes an enemy that I really want to destroy. And a lot of people can't relate to this at all, but some people can. And most people who can, I think, are men, because my understanding is that anger is a problem that men are much more likely to have than women, or at least a certain kind of anger, the kind of anger I'm describing. So I just wanted to share that. It's pretty personal, and I've made a ton of progress. Like, a lot of people I know well now would have no sense of this at all. But Well, one other thing I should say is that one thing I've noticed about myself is that very often my anger was completely distorted and irrational. Like I was mad at people for things that actually didn't justify any level of anger. But then there are times, as you noted in your remarks, Charlie, like where anger is justified. But in those moments, it's very important not to just completely lose your connection to the person where they become an enemy you want to destroy. Anyway, it's like this stuff really relates to deep personal like struggles that I've had in my life. And so I just wanted to note that. So that's one thing. Um, one other thing is one analogy worth bringing up that's not the family would be like a sports competition. I mean, if you just think about like two football teams or basketball teams going at it, like they are doing everything in their power to defeat the other side.
Mm.
But they're all playing by the same set of rules. And what it means to be a bad sport is basically to lose sight of the fact that this is competition within a greater context of cooperation. And like bad sports are people who kind of lose sight of that. And so that's another kind of useful analogy, perhaps. And finally, and this is really the last thing I'm going to say, because you can respond to any of this that you want. I did want to hear what you meant, Charlie, when you talked about mapping out and paying close attention to power dynamics, because we had a bit of a conversation about it, but I imagine some of the things you had in mind weren't really covered in the discussion we had 10 or 15 minutes ago. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that too. As I heard you uh discuss something in did you say tennis? Yeah, for me it was racquetball. I would get so angry and throw my racket and just, I wasn't really angry at the other person though. I was more angry at myself. And a lot of these things that I'm engaged in make me very angry. Some of it's righteous anger, I think. We are facing down, I think, I mentioned a little bit about end of life issues and euthanasia and assisted suicide already. We're facing down a culture, I think, which is on the verge of opening assisted suicide to the disabled, not people who are dying. That's bad enough in my view, but to the disabled, the non-dying disabled. There was a bill just introduced in California. Happily, it was defeated, at least in the short term, but I think it's going to come back, which explicitly invoked people with dementia as eligible for physician-assisted killing. So I think the absolutely appropriate response to this is a kind of outrage and anger in defense of disabled populations. Um, that said, if one loses the kind of sense of the people who are underneath the institutions and even the individuals opposing you with regard to these matters, it not only is ultimately really self-destructive to one's goals to just live in that angry place all of the time. It's totally self-destructive, right? It undermines the kind of person one wants to be, our happiness, our well-being, our ability to relate to other people in small ways. One develops a kind of habitus of anger as a response to lots of things outside of that. That's where I think communities of people kind of help, and communities and traditions kind of help step in and correct for those things. I did have people I would play racquetball with, and it became very clear after I threw the racket the first few times that they were happy to correct me and say that's just not an appropriate way sort of behave. And that kind of gets into your question about sports, I think, right? Like this common practice that has amount of diversity in it, but is obviously unified by all sorts of things, including rules and written and unwritten rules, cultures, um, the kind of understanding about what sportsmanship is, even apart from following the letter of the rules, right? That just develops over time. I really like that analogy, and I think more about that. So the kind of real contestation that goes on, a desire to really defeat one's opponent, but in the context of that is something I think more about. It's a helpful.
Yeah, actually, Charlie, with regard to tennis, one of the unwritten rules is So, if you hit a shot and it hits the net and then dribbles over and you win the point as a result. In pro tennis, you were expected to say to your opponent, sorry, like I got lucky, sorry. And I just remember this guy, Robin Soderling, a Swedish tennis player, didn't do that in a match against Nadal at Wimbledon. And Nadal afterward was like, I can't believe he didn't, just say sorry. Like it really bothered him. And frankly, it bothered me as an avid tennis fan. I'm just agreeing with what you're saying. Go on.
There's something very similar in basketball, by the way, where if you shoot a shot and you weren't trying to hit it off the backboard and it goes in, um, somebody usually makes a joke about like, well, the bank's open, I guess, late tonight or something like that, and it's understood that it was such a bad shot that it happened to go in. But I see these I see these highlights on ESPN and other places, YouTube now, I guess, of people just rejoicing, like, or self-aggrandizing at making a bank shot they didn't intend. I'm just like, I don't even understand what's going on here. But yeah, the sport has these really enculturated understandings that are really helpful, I think, to think about in this broader understanding. Wouldn't it be great if we could really go at it hard? And I do like to argue. I do like to debate. That's one of the reasons I love my relationship with Peter Singer is we can do that, right, in the context of these rules and a culture that that orients it and protects it in a particular kind of way. However, and this is your final point, the power dynamics often work out in such a way that those rules and cultures don't protect everyone the same. And again, I think you mentioned when you brought this up earlier, this tends to be something that maybe is associated with a kind of secularized understanding of ideology in higher education that we might not put forward at first blush, given the conversation we had here. But I think it's really important. I mean, Christ is very clear, I think in Matthew 25, to say that his face appears in the least among us, right? Those who are most marginalized, that's him in a very real way. And our failure to aid those individuals is a failure to aid him, an explicit failure to aid Christ. And so that's just Christians have to focus on those dynamics, who are the least among us, to find Christ in any given situation. But there's another reason we should focus on this, and that's especially in the academy, the power dynamics aren't what they seem in many ways, right? So sometimes, the kind of power dynamics are thought of as, well, the old school sort of Christian or religious understanding, kind of white male privilege, heteronormative privilege. We're all familiar sort of with the lingo that goes along with the kind of labeling of how power functions in these contexts, and maybe that gives us good reason to be skeptical. But if we can get beyond the slogans, if we can get beyond the faux attempts to have diversity serve the marginalized, in reality, just get to, again, what we led with, which is what's actually functioning here is a protection of power, right? A protection of those who have power, who are unified in the ways that in ways that are conformist, that conform to the ideology that is so dominant. If we can really bring to the fore a sense of like, well, how would somebody who has a view about prenatal justice feel in this department or at this university, right? Or in this club or in whatever context we're talking about? How do the power dynamics in fact work out for somebody like that? I was in my first year review in my first job in academia. And I had a Feminist for Life poster on my office door because I did my doctoral work and undergrad work at Notre Dame, and everyone at Notre Dame, all the professors, as you were waiting outside to meet with them, had all their like the things that they stood for, like on their office doors, in ways that were a little bit virtue signaling, but kind of fun to also read and look at and get a sense of who the professor was. And so when I became a professor, that's what I did. I put the stuff I cared about on my office door. Anyway, after that first year, I was told, not in the official report, but in the meeting, I needed to take down that poster. And I was a pre-tenure, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, had no power in the situation. So what did I do? I took down the poster, right? I'm not sure, looking back on it, that was the best move, but the power dynamics were such that I was just sort of, that's the way I thought it should work. I was told by the superior that I need to do this, so I did it. That's just one example, but there are many, many examples like that. If we can dig beneath the kind of rhetoric, if we can dig beneath the faux attempts to focus on power dynamics, but really dig into them, then I think there's really something important to focus on there and say, well, who are those who don't feel like they can speak? Who are those who don't feel like they can be fully who they are in this context? And let's pay particular attention to those voices. Seems important to me.
Charlie, this will have to be brief because our time is brief. But do you think a part of how that response can play out will have to do with thinking about this question of diversity that we began with, not just at sort of within a single institution, but across institutions, especially institutions of higher education more generally? If we think about the different aims that people have more explicitly, more openly, when it comes to what they want out of universities, should we really welcome a diversification where there are just going to be different institutions if you want to just study for its own sake or become a researcher, or you want to promote a particular social cause, or if you want to promote the mission of a religious group, rather than sticking with this model of universities and colleges that it seems that we've had since, say, the end of World War II or so. Is that something we should welcome? Is that something that we should lean into?
I think new models are necessary. As I mentioned in my remarks, I don't want to live too much in our current moment and suffer from the biases that we all suffer from of presentism. And our current moment is just this really important moment. We need to fundamentally change things because of the way things are now. One of the things that I mentioned earlier, taking a view over time, over decades, over centuries, even millennia, can help us maybe push back against that. But at least in the United States, and I think many other places, the institutions now are so compromised by this commitment to activism, this commitment to defend the ideology, that in order to get the kind of diversity you're talking about, we need a very different kind of institution. And one that I think, if it's going to be legitimate diversity, has to be very clear and not play games about what the commitments to unity are, right? What are the things that we really care about? If it is inquiry for its own sake, if it is just good to read great books and discuss those as ends in itself, then let's say that's what it is. And there are institutions that are doing that, right? That are saying, come here and study here. This is what we're about. Others are much more about saying, like, no, we have this particular commitment to the gospel, to this confessional group, and that's good too. And maybe it's good in a way that some secular institutions are also saying to us, maybe not as directly as you might hope, this is what we stand for. This is our unified commitment. And then we can sort of have people make their choices. Where would I want to go study? But do I want to go with the great books people? Do I want to go with the confessional people? Do I want to go with the social justice people? But it would just be really good, instead of pretending we're all sort of doing the same thing. This is like higher education, as if that, like, somehow encapsulates it all. It doesn't, right? It's much more diverse. It's much more these institutions are not doing the same thing. And it would be good to have some more truth and advertising, as it were, to say, this is what we're doing. If you'd like to do that with us, come join us.
Well, Charlie, thank you so much. It's always really fun to talk to you.
Yes, thanks so
Same
much,
here.
Charlie. Great to talk.
Totally my pleasure. Thank you.